The little girl standing on the shoulder of Route 17 at 2:47 in the morning was wearing a nightgown soaked through with rain that had stopped falling 3 hours earlier, and when Marcus pulled his truck to the side of the road and opened his door to help her, she looked up at him with eyes that held no reflection of his headlights, and said she had been waiting for him specifically, that she had been waiting for 17 years, that he was finally going to take her home to parents who would be so happy to see her again. Marcus should have driven away the moment he saw those lightless eyes, should have trusted the instinct that made his hands tighten on the steering wheel and his foot hover over the accelerator. But the child was crying and alone, and no decent person could leave a little girl stranded on a dark highway, regardless of how wrong every detail of the encounter felt. Her name was Emma, she said, climbing into the passenger seat with movements that seemed slightly out of sync with normal time, each gesture completing a fraction of a second before or after it should have. She was 7 years old, she said, though something in the way she pronounced her age made Marcus think she had been 7 for much longer than a single year. She lived on Blackwood Lane, she said, in the yellow house with the red door, and her parents were probably very worried because she had been gone for such a long time, and they would be so grateful to whoever brought her back safely. Marcus asked her what she was doing on the highway at this hour, where she had come from, how she had ended up alone on a road that saw little traffic even during daylight hours. Emma's answers came slowly, as if she was translating from a language that did not quite map onto English, explaining that she had gone for a walk and gotten lost, that she had been walking for a very long time, that she did not remember exactly when she had started or where she had been before the walking began. Her voice carried a quality that Marcus could not identify, a resonance that seemed to bypass his ears and enter his awareness through channels he did not know he possessed. The drive to Blackwood Lane should have taken 15 minutes according to his GPS, but the device kept recalculating as if the destination was moving, the estimated arrival time fluctuating wildly between 8 minutes and 3 hours depending on factors the technology could not seem to stabilize. Emma watched the screen with an interest that seemed academic rather than anxious, studying the confused algorithm as if it confirmed something she had already suspected. She asked Marcus if he had children of his own, and when he said he did not, she nodded slowly and said that was probably for the best, that children complicated things in ways that parents rarely anticipated. The statement was strange coming from a 7-year-old, delivered with a weariness that belonged to someone who had lived far longer than any child should have. Marcus glanced at his passenger and noticed details he had missed in the initial urgency of the rescue, the unnatural stillness of her chest that suggested breathing was optional rather than automatic, the way her wet nightgown had not begun to dry despite the warmth of the truck's heater, the mud on her bare feet that seemed to shift and resettle even though she sat motionless in the seat. He asked if she was cold, if she wanted the heat turned up, if there was anything he could do to make her more comfortable during the drive. Emma smiled at his concern, and the expression transformed her face in ways that made Marcus's hands tighten on the wheel until his knuckles went white. The smile was too wide, containing too many teeth, stretching muscles and configurations that should not have been possible for human facial structure. It lasted only a moment before returning to the sad, lost expression of a frightened child, but that moment was enough to confirm what Marcus had suspected since he first saw her standing in his headlights. His phone rang with a call from an unknown number, and when he answered with the shaking voice of a man who was beginning to understand the depth of his mistake, the voice on the other end belonged to a woman who identified herself as Deputy Sarah Chun from the County Sheriff Department. She said they had received reports of a vehicle stopped on Route 17, said they were concerned about a possible accident or breakdown, said they had dispatched a unit to check on the situation. He told the deputy that he had picked up a lost child, that he was driving her home to Blackwood Lane, that he might need assistance locating the address because his GPS seemed to be malfunctioning. The silence that followed his explanation stretched longer than professional protocol would normally allow, the deputy's breathing audible through the connection as she processed information that clearly troubled her in ways she was not immediately willing to articulate. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed, losing its professional neutrality and acquiring an edge that sounded like fear, poorly disguised as concern. She said there was no Blackwood Lane in the county. She said there had not been a Blackwood Lane in over 40 years, not since the development by that name had been demolished to make way for the reservoir that now covered the area. She said the yellow house with the red door had been the last structure removed before the flooding, the home of a family named Whitmore, whose daughter Emma had disappeared in 1987 and had never been found despite searches that dragged the newly formed lake repeatedly without recovering any trace of her body. Marcus looked at his passenger, at the little girl who called herself Emma, at the child who had been waiting 17 years for a ride home to a house that now lay beneath 50 feet of dark water. Emma looked back at him with those lightless eyes, her smile returning with the fullness that revealed too many teeth, her voice emerging with a resonance that bypassed normal hearing entirely. She said she had told him she had been waiting a long time. She said she had told him her parents would be happy to see her. She said the deputy did not understand because the deputy could not remember what had really happened, could not remember the truth that the water had swallowed along with everything else. The truck's engine died without warning, the dashboard lights flickering and fading as if the electrical system was being drained by something that required far more power than automotive technology was designed to provide. The headlights dimmed to ember glow and then extinguished entirely, leaving Marcus in darkness interrupted only by the pale luminescence that seemed to emanate from Emma herself, a light that cast no shadows because it did not operate according to physical laws. His phone continued its connection to the deputy, her voice growing increasingly urgent as she demanded updates, demanded his location, demanded to know what was happening. Emma reached toward the phone with fingers that had grown too long, joints visible in places where joints should not have been, skin stretching over bones that were rearranging themselves with each passing moment. She touched the device and it went silent, the screen displaying static that formed patterns too regular to be random, shapes that might have been letters in an alphabet that human language had never developed. She said the deputy could not help because the deputy did not believe, could not remember, would not accept the truth that waited beneath the surface of the official history the county had constructed to explain the inexplicable. The truth, Emma explained in a voice that was no longer entirely a child's, was that Blackwood Lane had not been demolished to build a reservoir. The truth was that something had happened there in the summer of 1987, something that had spread from house to house until every family in the development was affected, something that had required the authorities to make decisions that no official record could ever acknowledge. The flooding had not been a municipal project. It had been a containment measure, an attempt to bury what could not be destroyed, to hide what could not be explained, to forget what could not be forgiven. She said she had been the first, the child who had opened the door that should never have been opened, who had invited inside the thing that should never have been invited. She said the other children had followed her example, because children are trusting and curious and do not understand that some strangers are stranger than others. She said the parents had tried to save them, had tried everything that desperation could devise, and in the end had agreed to the solution the authorities proposed because there was nothing else left to try. The truck began moving without Marcus touching the accelerator, rolling forward on the dark highway toward a destination that the dead GPS could not display, but that Emma seemed to know with perfect certainty. The steering wheel turned beneath his hands as if guided by forces that did not require his cooperation, correcting his attempts to regain control with gentle but irresistible pressure. He was no longer driving. He was being transported, carried toward something that had been waiting since before he was born, patient and hungry, and finally close enough to its goal that patience was no longer required. Emma said she had tried to go home many times over the years, had appeared to many drivers on many roadsides, had asked for help from people whose instincts were usually strong enough to make them refuse. But the rules required an invitation, required someone to choose freely to help her, required a ride given voluntarily before the journey could be completed. Most people drove past without stopping. Many slowed but did not stop. A few had stopped but had driven away when they saw her clearly, their fear overriding their compassion in time to save themselves. Marcus had been different. Marcus had not just stopped but had opened his door, had not just spoken to her but had invited her inside, had not just offered help but had agreed to take her all the way home. His compassion had been stronger than his fear, his decency more powerful than his instinct, and now that decency was carrying him toward a destination that would test the limits of what human minds could experience and survive. The highway ended in water that appeared without warning, the truck's tires leaving asphalt and entering the reservoir that should have been miles away but was somehow now directly in their path. The vehicle did not float or sink, but glided across the surface as if the water had become solid enough to support their passage, dark ripples spreading from their movement toward shores that were too far away to see. Beneath the surface, visible through water that glowed with the same pale light that emanated from Emma, shapes moved in patterns that suggested purpose rather than random swimming, forms that might have been human if humans had continued evolving in directions that nature had decided against. Emma pointed toward the center of the lake, toward a disturbance in the water that looked like bubbles rising from great depth, churning and frothing as if something massive was ascending from the bottom. She said they were almost home, said her parents had been waiting so long, said they would be so happy to finally have visitors after all the years of isolation beneath the surface. She said the water had preserved everything perfectly, the houses and the streets, and the families who had chosen to stay when the flooding came, who had preferred drowning together to living apart in a world that would never understand what they had become. The yellow house rose from the water like a submarine breaching the surface. its red door facing the truck with the welcoming posture of a structure that had been anticipating this arrival for decades. Water streamed from its windows and poured from its eaves, but the interior visible through those windows was dry and warm and lit with a golden glow that beckoned with the false promise of shelter. Figures stood on the porch, a man and woman whose features were close enough to human to suggest ancestry, but different enough to confirm that ancestry had been left behind long ago. Emma's parents waved at the approaching truck with enthusiasm that seemed genuine, despite the wrongness of their proportions, the extra joints in their waving arms, the additional eyes that blinked from positions on their faces where eyes should not have been. They were happy, genuinely happy, to see their daughter returning with a guest who would join their community beneath the water, who would learn to breathe the liquid darkness as they had learned, who would transform as they had transformed until the memory of surface living faded into irrelevance. Marcus tried the door handle and found it locked from outside by pressure he could not identify, water beginning to seep through seals that had been watertight moments earlier. The truck was sinking now, descending into the lake toward the development that waited below, toward Blackwood Lane and its yellow houses and its red doors and its residents who had been waiting 40 years for new neighbors to join their eternal community. Emma sat beside him with perfect composure, her transformation accelerating as they descended, her childish form giving way to something that belonged in deep water, something designed for pressure and darkness and hunting. The deputy's voice crackled suddenly from his phone, connection restored by factors that physics could not explain, her words urgent as she screamed coordinates into her radio, as she demanded rescue units and dive teams and resources that would arrive far too late to matter. She had believed, finally, had remembered the truth that the county had worked so hard to bury, had understood that the stories about Blackwood Lane were not legends created to explain a municipal project, but warnings that should never have been forgotten. Emma's parents opened the truck door from outside, water flooding in with temperature that should have been freezing, but felt somehow warm, welcoming, comfortable in ways that Marcus's body was already beginning to accept. His lungs filled with liquid that did not drown him, but changed him, each breath pulling him further from what he had been, and closer to what Blackwood Lane required its residents to become. The transformation was not painful, but ecstatic, every cell in his body singing with the joy of finally reaching the home he had never known he was searching for. The last thought Marcus had as a human was a memory of his decision to stop for a crying child on a dark highway, the compassion that had seemed so right in the moment it was expressed. He had wanted to help. He had wanted to do good. He had wanted to be the kind of person who did not drive past suffering without offering assistance. Now he understood that some suffering exists as bait. Some tears flow to attract rather than express. Some children wait on roadsides not because they are lost, but because they are hunting. The yellow house welcomed him through its red door, and Blackwood Lane added another resident to its census, another transformation to its collection, another driver who had learned too late that compassion without caution was not virtue but vulnerability. The deputy found his truck the next morning, floating empty on the reservoir's surface, doors open and interior dry despite having been submerged all night. The official report described mechanical failure and probable drowning, another tragedy to add to the lake's long history of claiming victims through accident and misadventure. But the deputy knew the truth, remembered now what the county had tried to make everyone forget. She knew that somewhere beneath 50 feet of dark water, a community continued to exist and grow and wait for new members to join its family. She knew that the crying child would appear again on other roadsides, on other dark nights for other drivers whose compassion was stronger than their instinct. And she knew that she could do nothing to stop it, could only document the disappearances and maintain the fiction, and hope that the next driver would be wise enough to keep driving when they saw a little girl in a wet nightgown waiting for a ride home. The water remained still most nights, its surface reflecting stars that the residents below can no longer see. But sometimes when conditions are right and the barrier between depths and surface grows thin, figures can be seen walking along the bottom, following streets that maps no longer show, entering houses that official history insists do not exist. They wave at boats that pass overhead. They smile with too many teeth. They wait with patience measured in decades for the next visitor, who will stop when they should drive on, who will help when they should flee, who will learn that some roads lead to destinations from which no one returns. Blackwood Lane is always accepting new residents. The red doors are always open. And somewhere on Route 17, a crying child stands in headlights that approach and pass and occasionally, wonderfully, stop